My face is doing that.
Sorry to everybody.
Yeah. I was just like glistening, and my face is doing that stress thing that it does when I'm like, oh, that's really awful. Okay. Brain process. Yeah. And I'm just going to kind of continue that vibe. I'm sorry, friends. As we said, there's a content warning for this episode, including violence, murder, destabilization of nations, genocide, etc. Like, we're talking about all of it, we're unpacking all of it, and unfortunately this is like the very real reality. We get a film that presents it to us in a way that's just like gives you the next step, I guess, in terms of the questions. You're like, why does that? And then we looked it up. So here we are. We're helping you understand. But I titled my section, The United States' Long History of Destabilizing Nations and Acting Like Surprise Pikachu When Migration Increases. We have discussed the seeded history of the U.S. playing puppeteer in other countries before, so the unpacking of this topic will not be anything fundamentally new to the show. We did this in our episode on La Llorona, covering U.S. intervention in Guatemala, among others. As on the nose and quirky and fun as this film was, a lot of it was intentionally in your face. And I remember even when we were watching, we're like, that was so silly. But also, like, I'm sure it matters. Like, especially like after researching and reading about it, like, it was all very intentionally done as like, why? And then you're like, oh, I'm going to go look up why. So in processing the context and reality of what millions of migrants face at the U.S. border, this film's more silly moments hold purpose because and it's because the director and writers don't want us to miss the point, the nods and the cues to information. So this is why we love us some media analysis. A character that really impacted me and really broke my heart in culture shock was Ricky, a young boy from Guatemala who was seeking safety in America, only to be detained and murdered at the border. The loss of this character was, as unfortunate as it was, an intentional one, an unfortunate reminder of what happens to many children who arrive at the U.S. border who don't make it. His background as a Guatemalan migrant also calls attention to the many Guatemalan migrants that risk their lives trying to reach the U.S., fleeing a situation that the U.S. helped create. And in an article titled Fleeing a Hell the U.S. Helped Create, Why Central Americans Journey North by Julian Bourget, they explore the historical context of the dysfunctional relationship between the U.S. and its southern neighbors, particularly Central America. They highlight the root causes of migration, including inequality, violence, and historical U.S. interventions. They also call attention to the loss of a young Guatemalan girl named Jacqueline Can Makin, who died in U.S. custody in 2018. And it's just one, unfortunately, of many. So I don't know if the director was trying to connect Ricky, because this was made in 2019, right? And that death happened in 2018. It could be a call to that loss, but also the losses of like countless children at the border. So they go on to say the forces driving ordinary people to leave their homes and put their lives at risk, crossing deserts with smugglers to get to the U.S. border, are deeply rooted in Central America's history of inequality and violence, in which the U.S. has long played a defining role. So I'm really going to unpack the ways that the United States has destabilized other nations and then thus influenced the need for migration, and how the reason I'm covering in this way is because it's like the way that we are pitched the migration crisis as the news industries will be like, migration crisis, immigration, blah, blah, we need to close the borders. It's a national security risk. And it's like, these are human lives that the U.S. has disrupted, destabilized their entire nation. And it's like the amount of things the U.S. has to pay reparations on. This is one of them.
Yeah. The audacity for them to be like, they're the problem. Yeah,
no, because they're not. They're the result of the U.S. doing crappy things, horrific, awful things. So just to give you like kind of the Spark Notes version, the United States has destabilized Central American countries for various reasons, including economic and geopolitical interests. Some key points are as follows. During the Cold War, the U.S. pursued policies in Central America to counter perceived communist influences, specifically in Guatemala. For the article I mentioned before, Guatemala's long civil war can in turn be traced back to the 1954 coup against the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz, which was backed by the U.S. Washington backed Guatemalan military, which was responsible for the genocide of the native population. An estimated 200,000 people were killed between 1960 and 1996, which is what we discussed in our La Llorona episode. America has decimated Guatemala. So Ricky's need to travel, if you wanted to read that article alone, is honestly for many people like the only way that they can stay with their families is to migrate. And the price of that migration has, because of the policies and border lockdowns, exponentially risen from like $2,000 to like $12,000 per person. And that blocks the safe route, essentially. People are forced to take the most dangerous route because it is just not fiscally possible in a disenfranchised country filled with civil war to expect a human being to pay $12,000 to get here per individual. So they travel the only way that they can, only to breach the border and be met with what we saw in the film. So it continues on that the U.S. supported authoritarian regimes and military interventions in El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua during the 1970s and 1980s to curb leftist movements. Specifically, El Salvador was trapped in a cycle of violence that can be traced back to civil conflict in which the U.S. was a protagonist, training and funding right-wing death squads in the name of fighting communism. The quote goes, "The Civil War was really destroyed the economic base of the country and any sense of functioning democracy. It left a massively militarized society." Next is the Nicaraguan Contra War. In Nicaragua, the U.S. supported the Contras, a rebel group, in their efforts to overthrow the Sandinista government during the 1980s. And the Contras were specifically accused of human rights abuses and conflicts that led to a significant destabilization of that region. So the U.S. backed
always
that
on the
group.
wrong side of history.
Yep, and look at it happen now.
And we're like, we're surprised, Pikachu. Like, are you kidding?
Yeah. Additionally, economic interests, thinking of like the countless just corporations that have seeded interests in Central America and have taken advantage and disenfranchised those populations through factories and other cruel labor laws. It's also just poisoned their land. But economic interests such as demand for resources and corporate investments have played a role in U.S. interventions in Central America. Multinational corporations, often with ties to the U.S., have been involved in industries like agriculture, mining, and energy, leading to disputes over land and resources, as well as just like destruction of those lands and resources. There was a documentary, I'm going to try to retroactively cite it in here, but I watched it I think in college or after, I don't know. It was a long time ago, but it was all about how a factory basically like poisoned the land, and that all these people were basically getting sick and having like cancer and other things because not even that they were working in the factories, but because the areas around it had been so polluted by these factories. So that is just another instance of why someone might want to leave a place and not even just want to, but need to for their survival. Additionally, drug trade and violence, the demand for illegal drugs in the U.S. has contributed to a drug trafficking and violence in Central America. U.S. anti-drug policies, such as Plan Colombia, have had unintended consequences, pushing drug cartels into neighboring countries like Honduras and Guatemala. America's war on drugs, essentially. You know how Reagan loved to say war on things.
On drugs. It's definitely on drugs and not black people, right?
Yeah. So all these policies trickle into other places and cause problems. Essentially, as well as these things, the migration crisis, the economic and political inability resulting in past interventions have contributed to a migration crisis, with people fleeing violence and seeking better economic opportunities in the U.S. and not even receiving those. There's a few articles that I cite that I haven't like outlined specifically, but that are in our show notes that kind of go through like the fact that like the racism in America and how that influences job markets and access to fair wages makes it so like if you are not a white man in America, your access to the American dream doesn't exist. And especially for immigrant populations that are, because of being at fear of risk of ICE and other detaining organizations will work in unsafe and inhumane conditions just to like survive once they get here, even if they get through. They're not going to reach economic stability or any semblance of the American dream. Anyone who does is lucky. It's an exception to the overall experience. And then the impact on indigenous communities. Indigenous communities in Central America have been disproportionately affected by U.S. interventions and economic activities leading to displacement and land conflicts. We know how much America hates indigenous people. They want all the land. America wants all of it, and they don't care who they have to murder to get it. And we see this time and time again. So that's not even touching the historical context of America and the Spanish impact on Mexico and the destabilization and the economic disenfranchising of that country. I'll briefly touch on it. So following the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. This had severe and lasting consequences for Mexico. Here are just some ways of how Mexico was harmed by this war. Territorial loss, economic disenfranchisement and devastation, social disruption because of the economy, poverty and social unrest, as well as indigenous communities being decimated by the war, political instability. The defeat in the war intensified political instability. It led to changes in government with different leaders and factions vying for power. An impact on Mexican identity. The war had a profound impact on Mexican national identity. The sense of loss contributed to the shaping of a strong Mexican nationalism that emphasized resistance to foreign aggression. And just like all these things, relationships with the U.S., there's been a conflict there. Like recently, the U.S. was like, we're going to go get all the cartel guys. And the president was like, no. Like, go, you don't own here. You stole our land. You stole Texas and California. Leave us alone. And then there's just like a legacy of injustice that has taken place, where, as we see at the border, just a true lack of care or regard for human lives there. So the Mexican-American War had far-reaching consequences for Mexico, impacting its territorial integrity, economic, social fabric, and national identity. And these scars of this conflict continue to shape Mexico's historical narrative and its relationship with the United States. So that's just like your SparkNotes version. So I'll start to wrap up soon. The situation that many migrants are fleeing make this travel a necessity for survival, as if you didn't get that from my little section and you got it in Gabe's. However, once they arrive at the border, as we saw in the film, the racism of the American system treats them as inhumanely as possible, resulting in severe harm, both emotionally and physically, and sometimes even in death. The systemic dehumanization and othering of a population is something America has had a lot of experience in and utilizes at the border. We discuss this at length next week. Whether it's validating genocide or reframing colonization or even reinforcing white supremacy as a validation for harm, America took the playbook from Western Europe and ran with it. We see this othering on screen in the doctor that conducts non-consensual experiments on the migrants detained at the facility with no care for their survival or safety. This is not something that is exclusive to the movie. This has happened many times throughout real U.S. history, which we've talked about extensively. But honestly, at this point, I feel like we should like write a book. Companion piece for each movie that we cover, because honestly, like it's there's a lot of historical context that really just makes these points in the film hit harder, and especially if you've been like inundated with American media that just severely others immigrant populations and migrant populations at this border, at all borders, anyone who is BIPOC, etc. There is just a lot of like misinformation and intentional language used as a way of dehumanizing and othering these groups, so that similarly to how like people view prison systems, that it's all oriented to make us not care. It's all, or because if we did care, we would do something. If we knew the depth of what was actually taking place, you would feel compelled as a human being to do something. The purpose of what all the like historical writing around it and everything else is to make us not really see what's happening. So therefore we will not care.
And just show them as not people.
Mm-hmm.
If you take away their peopleness, then we don't feel bad about it. There's a really good Black Mirror episode about that, actually.
Yeah. This like systemic othering that has made it so we can look away. And like, honestly, it's like there's America, there's a reason that Germany followed America, like looked at America on how to dehumanize other people during the Holocaust. Like it is a whole thing. Like they watched us on how to do it and then copied that. So like there is a long history of the United States intentionally skewing the story, changing the narrative to benefit and instill a sense of United States pride and a lack of recognition of the harm that has been caused. So with all that to say, the last thing I'll cover is just like the psychological harm of assimilation, and that we kind of see in the film, like the whole idea of like in the simulation, like this white man would think that would be the glorious American dream. Like these people are traveling not to become Americans. They're coming like to preserve their culture, to live. Yeah. So this like melting pot, icky, like, oh, I speak English. I don't have my accent. Like I wear pastels and live in this house covered in American flags. Like, you know, like, and I eat pizza, like the grossest looking pizza I've ever seen would be in Texas. And like, just cause like, you know, the New York pizza is different. And then like also just like the burgers and like all the other American staple foods that are just very much not
like, why wouldn't they want to keep eating their food?
Yeah. So it's like this like whitewashing of people who are moving into these countries, or specifically the United States, that does extreme like mental harm. And like the idea that the simulation that people would want to experience before their death would be this like really eerie, gross, just like America time. Like, you know, like it's just really, only he would think that would be like the sweet send off that they would need. You know what I mean? Like,
I gave you America. Like,
and it's like that's not what we should want.
Are here for. That's what
they're literally for. Like, if anything, it's to preserve their own cultures and like find a safe place to be themselves and live. And that's not what America gives them, because it's drenched in racism and genocide, honestly. So last thing I'll cover is cultural assimilation and how it affects mental health, which isn't very well mined. They have a whole article that kind of goes into like all the details of this and like what forced assimilation versus chosen assimilation and how that impacts the mind. But one quote that stood out to me is that cultural assimilation can lead to loss of identity and cause significant psychological stress, specifically for immigrants. This can range from homesickness to depression to severe mental illness. In addition, the act of migration can cause an individual to experience cultural bereavement, a form of grief caused by the loss of one's culture, thus a core aspect of their identity. And this can further exacerbate by the loss of key cultural markers such as language, traditions, customs, and food, which can also intensify the alienation felt by an individual when trying to relate to someone, a family member, or someone from where they came from. So it's just like the way that the simulation itself and the idea of like what America wants people to do when they come here is just so detrimental and harmful to the individuals who are trying to find safety. So even once they get through, even if they survive the border, the like culture shock, the kind of codes, like the survival necessitated code switching that needs to happen is just so detrimental to the people who are having to experience that it just kind of perpetuates that harm. And
I think like, and he also the mayor is like, he's this white man, and he was like, yeah, you just have culture shock. It's normal. You'll get over it. And it's like, okay, but when we acknowledge what culture shock is, right, it is this reaction to having your history and like your regular life like erased and ignored, and you're like being forced into a whole different like understanding and operation and like relearning things, and that's really traumatizing. And to just brush it off and be like, oh, this is just culture shock, get over it. And not labeling it as like it is a trauma.
And it's just like totally neglecting like the US's like long history of like what they've done to their own native population in like the residential schools, and even the sponsorship program that they're forcing children into. I imagine at least some of the time, if not most of the time, they're being put in families that do not align with where they're coming from and do not allow for them to be culturally safe. So.
Yeah. And I think that, so like in Don't Worry, Darling, when, Alice was confronting Jack and saying like, you don't love me, like you can't love me, right? Because you put me here and you're trying to strip me of who I am to fit into this thing. That's what's happening in this film. And instead of one man wanting you to fulfill the purposes of what he deems a wife should, you are a person who's being confronted by an entire country of ideals trying to reduce you to the housewife that you're supposed to be, that kind of like ideology. It's even more terrifying because it's a whole system that's coming down on you. And
that just as a fun, not the government article that they found from the NPR article that you found, it was 1,600 pages.
Of
just like horrible things that have happened. ICE detention. And
like 1,600 pages, right, of reports, and they've only been here since 2003.
Yeah,
it's younger than my baby sister.
Yeah,
you have not a lot of time and you've done all this. It's a nightmare. One little thing I will say, just as like for folks like to add, like, here's, if you enjoyed this and you want to learn more, there is a book that is horror and is beautifully written. It's so lovely written. I am transfixed by it, called Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas, who's done like, Gothic horror before. But this one talks about, it's set in a time when Americans are trying to come and take over pieces of Mexico. And it's like the families that were in power in Mexico, getting up their own forces to go and fight against them. And that's like happening in the background because like the forefront is like monsters in love, actually. And it's beautifully written. So highly, highly recommend that as a read, and that you're also like subconsciously learning about the political systems and the situations that were happening in Mexico at the time. And so that's stuff that like, I don't know. And I learn a lot of that stuff from like her or Sofia Moreno Garcia. I learned so much from her too. So you can, like this film, you can absolutely learn and become interested and knowledgeable in situations that we wouldn't be fully aware of in a, fictional entertainment place. Like this can start as something that you're like, wow, this is just like an interesting horror movie to watch. Now let's do some research. Let's see how we got here and why they're saying this and why Marisol would travel to America for this dream, behind the sky dream, while 9 months pregnant.
Yeah.
Why would Ricky travel all by himself from Guatemala through up to America for what? Do your research and listen to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for listening, y'all. And I hope you give it a chance. It doesn't have like a whole lot of money. I still think it was interesting, right? And I think it gets the point across. It doesn't try to trick you. It's trying too hard for you to know, like you were saying, Kat, like it's focused more on you understanding and knowing what's going on and not hiding its intentions at all. It's like, we're not, what
it's
this
like,
is about.
It doesn't want you to miss the point at all. Like it really is just like, this means this.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do about it?
And it's like there are gross points and there are like some somewhat bloody moments, like especially at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But even still, it's very subdued in comparison to some horror films out there. And so, and it happens in the final act, really. Like any of the gore or horror would happen really like the last 10 minutes of the film. So besides the disgusting eating, most of it is it's just like a psychological thriller. And so if you could handle Don't Worry Darling, you can absolutely handle this. And so I highly recommend and to look at it with your media analysis glasses on and appreciate that it exists. And everyone tell Gigi Salguero, thank you. Thank you. I hope you do more stuff.
Yeah.
And I love you. Like as a creator. Good job.
Agreed.
So check out all those episodes of the Ghouls and don't get married.
Play with your kids.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to change it to something else because then it's...
Because it's still sad because then they're here. They're just in America. You don't want them to be here.
Or they didn't.
Or they didn't get to America. You're right.
And
it sucks. All of it sucks. So, bye.
Bye.